Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. We are back at Riss, one of our favorite restaurants. We thank them for their hospitality. What we're going to talk about this episode, folks, is going to baffle you and blow your mind unless you have a deeply cynical view of human nature. And if you do have a deeply cynical view of human nature, then this will confirm all of that deeply embedded cynicism. Our guest is Craig Whitlock. He has written a new book, a terrific book, a page-turner called Fat Leonard. The subtitle reads, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced, keyword, seduced, the United States Navy. Craig, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Get right up on that microphone if you'd be so kind. Who is Fat Leonard, and why is he worthy of a book of this magnitude and size?
Well, Fat Leonard's real name is Leonard Glenn Francis, and he's a Malaysian citizen, but he's also one of the world's greatest con men, perhaps ever. He was a businessman based in Singapore, and he supplied services to Navy ships.
U.S. Navy ships.
U.S. Navy ships and subs whenever they entered ports in the Asia Pacific. So from Singapore to Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, even Russia and Vladivostok, and Japan.
Tokyo,
whenever there was a U.S. Navy ship going into anything other than a U.S. military base, Leonard's company had the contract to resupply, give them fresh water, take the trash, protect the ship, and he had hundreds of millions of dollars worth of contracts to do this.
Craig, help my audience understand, what does a Navy vessel or a strike carrier group need when it comes to a port?
Well, it needs just about everything you can think of. And one way Leonard described it, he was the Walmart for the U.S. Navy, right? They're the ships at sea for months at a time, but they occasionally stop in port visits. Either they were conducting exercises with local militaries or just for liberty, for the sailors get a few days of shore leave. And they need fresh water, fresh food, anything that they need to fix the ship.
They need things put on the ship, and they need things taken off the ship.
And they need things to get on and off the ship, right? You need fenders to keep the ship from banging into the pier. You need barges. You need cranes.
Tugs,
tugboats,
fuel,
any of
bilging, all of these things.
Leonard provided it.
And Leonard provided it. And I want to underscore something that comes up in the book. He did this work well.
He did, and that's why part of why he kept getting contracts was his company was reliable and enabled the U.S. Navy to get into ports in a part of the world where it didn't have its own bases or didn't have allied military bases. And this was critical after the end of the Cold War. The U.S. used to have a big base in the Philippines called Subic Bay.
Subic Bay, yes.
Which was the biggest naval base overseas, and that had to close down in 1991. So after that, the U.S. Navy was dependent on other countries to let them visit their ports, and they needed a private contractor to help them. And Leonard stepped into the breach and provided those services pretty well for 25 years.
And Leonard knew that this was the biggest Navy in the world and was probably the biggest cash cow for his company on planet Earth.
Well, he figured that out pretty quickly, that with the Navy in particular, as you said, not only were they the most powerful Navy, but the wealthiest. And as with a lot of parts of the U.S. military, the mission always comes first, and cost is a secondary concern, if that. And Leonard knew that if he provided the ship captains with all the services they needed and on time, they really didn't care how much they had to pay. But it went beyond that for Leonard, right? He very quickly learned how to defraud the Navy, how to bribe people, how to rig contracts. So he took it to a new level with his criminal conduct.
And we will get into that, and particularly the seduction and the vast sums of money well above what would normally be paid for services of this kind. But I also want to talk about something that is, as I read the book, central to this interaction and this relationship. The attack on the USS Cole and the imperative after that for the Navy not to just have these basic services, but to have something that would approximate or give them a greater sense of security when they went to a port.
That's right. And just to recap, in 2000, there was an attack on the USS Cole in Aden in Yemen, an Arabian port on the Persian Gulf. And there was a little motorboat with Al-Qaeda guys and a bunch of explosives. And the ship...
A classic example of asymmetric warfare, very little technological... I mean, this was not technologically advanced at all. It was as basic and simple and rudimentary as possible, yet it was lethal.
lethal and the worst attack on a U.S. Navy ship in years, and killed a few dozen sailors and almost sank a guided missile destroyer. And after that, this completely changed the calculus for the U.S. Navy whenever they were visiting foreign ports, was how do we protect our ships, not just from a foreign navy or hostile forces, but how do we protect them from terrorist attack? And so they immediately stopped visiting a lot of ports that weren't military bases, and this changed where ships could go. And Leonard, again, he's a very clever businessman, so he invented something that he called, in a brilliant stroke of marketing, the Ring of Steel. And all the Ring of Steel was really a bunch of barges with cables linking them that he would surround a ship in port. And it looked pretty good, right? You know, you thought, okay, well, some little Al-Qaeda motorboat isn't going to get past that. But he charged an arm and a leg for it, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a few days of port visits. And this made him a bundle of money. And the irony was the Navy never really tested it or checked it out to see if it would work, if there was some kind of attack. But Leonard kept going, and this made him a bundle of money.
So it checked a box for the Navy. It certainly checked a profitability box for Leonard, and it met this new reality. The Navy wanted security. Here's a guy who came up with something, sounded good, might have worked, might have not, but who cared? Or the level of care was less than the necessity of having it in the first place, because no admiral could take a strike force or a vessel into a port without having something, right?
Well, they could, but it was on their necks if something
if something went wrong.
So
right.
if a ship captain said, I don't want to pay for that, I don't think it's going to work, cost too much money, well, if something did happen, the risk to the ship captain's career would be enormous.
They'd be over.
And Leonard knew this, that nobody really wanted to risk their reputation or career by not ordering it. But again, Leonard, he's a supremely clever businessman and criminal. He always took things a step further. So on the occasion when a ship captain questioned whether the Ring of Steel is necessary or dragged their feet on whether to order it, sometimes he would cook up a fake plot, right? He would have a fishing vessel come in, or he'd report it to the local police that he had gotten rumors that there was a terrorist attack being planned, right? And it was fake, but all he had to do was trigger that alarm to make people think, oh my God, we have to have the Ring of Steel. So again, very clever criminal mind, but it worked. And so he made millions and millions of dollars off this, the Ring of Steel.
I just want to say that again, have you say that he would concoct threats.
That's right.
And phony them up, sufficient to fake out the United States Navy.
That's right, and it didn't take much.
It almost feels like they wanted to be faked out. Like, oh, well, if there's anything in this precautionary environment, we're going to err on the side of hyper protection, and if that means paying Fat Leonard more, we'll pay Fat Leonard more.
Well, that's correct. That's not far off. And again, you have to think back to after 9/11. The threat scenario was extraordinary, and Leonard was giving port services in a lot of countries with Muslim majority populations like Indonesia, Malaysia, places like this in Southeast Asia, where there was a threat from Al-Qaeda.
Right.
There were terrorist attacks in Bali, Indonesia in the early 2000s. So it wasn't that this was just a theoretical threat. Leonard was capitalizing on the fear and what was a real threat in some regards, but again, he knew how to exploit it and take advantage.
The full name again, Leonard Glenn Francis. We're going to, on the other side of this break, talk about Leonard Glenn Francis, the person. He didn't quite like the nickname Fat Leonard. It was almost universally applied because he sort of visually lived it out, but still, he's a complex person and probably one of the most aggressive, perpetual multitaskers of the early 21st century, to his great profitability and ultimately legal peril. Our guest, Craig Whitlock, the book, Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. I'm Major Garrett, segment 2 of The Takeout, coming your way in just a couple of minutes.
He's this extraordinarily colorful character. He's this charming rogue,
almost you
if
couldn't
will.
make him up. I mean, he's beyond, like, imagining. Welcome back to The Takeout. Our thanks again to Riss. Our lunch will be arriving momentarily. Chicken Milanese, as always, for me. And Craig's going to go along right with me. We're going to enjoy it together. The book, Fat Leonard, How One Man bribed, bilked, and seduced the U.S. Navy. So, Leonard Glenn Francis, tell my audience a little bit about this person. When I said he's a multitasker, it's almost incomprehensible how many balls he kept juggling all the time, not just the U.S. Navy, all these various vessels, all these various places. It wasn't like he had one base of operations and only one port to focus on. He was constantly trying to get the Navy in and out of ports all over Asia. He had lots of wives, girlfriends, and other things on the side.
That's right. He's this extraordinarily colorful character. He's this charming rogue.
Almost you
if
couldn't
will.
make him up. I mean, he's beyond, like, imagining. It seems to me.
Imagine
larger than life.
He's kind of like a Bond villain. He's got a little bit of that in him. But again, his name is Fat Leonard, but he was a big guy, right? And he was about my height, 6'3", but he weighed at one point almost 500 pounds. So this is a guy trying to get on Navy ships and work in ports, but he's a really, really big guy, right? And that's how he got his name. At one point, he had gastric bypass surgery to reduce the size of his stomach because he was struggling with his weight so much, and that slimmed him down to 350 pounds. But he's still really
a svelte 350.
He stood out, but in a way, I think this helped him. People didn't see him as a threat or a risk. They saw him as this jolly fat guy, right? He was very personable, very charming, just could make friends with anybody, knew how to talk but not over talk, and he just had this real psychological insight into people that made him very, very effective at cultivating sources.
As the script writers like to say, what's his backstory? What's his origin story? Who is he?
So Leonard Francis grew up in Malaysia, in an island called Penang, Malaysia, in the Strait of Malacca, and he has this mix of ancestry from India, from Portugal, but his father's side of the family traces its lineage back to Scotland. They were Scottish planters who had moved to Malaysia. So he has this Anglo name, and he grew up in Penang, Malaysia, but he went to some international schools. His family is Roman Catholic.
Okay.
And so from an early age, he really glommed on to American culture. He loved watching the Godfather movies, right, of course, and styled himself after Marlon Brando. He loved Elvis and Fleetwood Mac, and he went to the Singapore American School for a couple years when he was a teenager, so he learned how to talk American, which was also a secret to his success. He wasn't, he talked like an American, he sounded like one. In fact, in the early years, he would tell Navy sailors or officers that he had gone to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and that he knew Michael Jordan, right? He's always telling, as he called them, sea stories. But people believe this, right? But he was a really convincing raconteur, and
a great gift of gab.
Great gift of gab, and people wanted to believe it, I think.
Right. And you draw a portrait of him at his apex, essentially with a front row seat of almost every significant Navy ceremony in which he wanted to attend. If Fat Leonard wanted to be there, and it was a significant event, not just at the low level of the United States Navy, but the upper echelon, he could be there. And they would treat him like a mini celebrity.
That's right. And so Leonard didn't spend a lot of time or attention cultivating enlisted sailors. Right. He wanted the officers, in particular senior officers, and he wanted people in certain positions of power. And he would identify officers who he thought were up-and-comers, who might become admirals someday, and he would cultivate relationships over many years in some cases, because he knew in the military rank means everything. And that if he made friends with admirals, that the rest of the fleet would take their cues from that. They would think that, Fat Leonard's a friend of Admiral Smith or so-and-so, so who are they to question what he's up to with his business? So you mentioned these ceremonies. The Navy always has what they call change of command ceremonies, like other branches of the military. If commanding officer of a ship or a fleet commander is coming in new every couple of years, they have a big ceremony on the deck of the ship.
Super important.
Yeah, very important. And Leonard knew this was important to be seen as a VIP. So he would get invitations either from the admiral himself or somebody on his staff, and he would make sure that he got a seat in the front row or two because he wanted to be known as a VIP, and he would bring a photographer so he could take pictures with the admirals or the senior officers, and he played this up, but it worked amazingly well. Again, he had this knack of understanding how the U.S. military worked and how there was this deference to rank. And as long as people perceived him to be a friend of the brass,
it could make him
gave him
untouchable.
power. It did make him untouchable for many years.
Wow. So for my audience, and look, there are folks in this audience from San Diego, my hometown. You've read about this story. From Puget Sound, huge naval base there. You probably have awareness of this story. Jacksonville, Norfolk for sure. But for those who are not well-versed in the Navy culture, how does someone like Fat Leonard suddenly become email partners with an admiral or a vice admiral or a captain? How does that happen?
Well, it takes time and patience on Leonard's part, but one thing he was good at is he understood that when a Navy ship's been at sea for months or weeks and they come into port, he knows how to treat people like royalty, right? So when the ship captain comes into port and has a few days, he makes sure that the contract would call for providing a Toyota and a driver for the ship captain, but Leonard would make sure it was a Mercedes or a Jaguar, and he'd make sure he had his hand-picked driver to show the visiting senior officers where to go shopping, where to stay, where to go, and then Leonard would throw invariably a very fancy meal, and he knew that he would show the visiting senior officers a taste of the high life.
Right.
They were accustomed to getting food on the ship, but he was going to take them to Michelin-starred restaurants in Asia. He was going to bring in not just champagne, but Cristal, Dom Perignon, wines from France, you name it. He was going to give them the best. And Cuban cigars, you name it. He was going to show them the best kind of treats to
ingratiate himself and
Absolutely.
Make friends and make an impression.
And it worked. Now, one thing to remember, under federal ethics regulations, he's a defense contractor.
Right.
So people in uniform, people in the Navy are not supposed to accept gifts worth more than $20. And they all know this. They've all been trained this.
Right.
But Leonard would pretend these rules didn't exist, and for the most part, people would ignore it. And so he would throw dinners that would cost up to $1,000 a person. And this was something, as you can imagine, would get talked about, right? And
Right.
one ship captain would tell the next, when you go to Singapore or Hong Kong
Or Tokyo or
make sure
whatever.
Leonard takes you out for a good time. And they all took advantage.
And this was part and parcel of Fat Leonard's not only way to keep the contracts going, to keep overcharging and have no one or very few people question it, or be insulated if someone did question it, and an admiral or a vice admiral or a captain would say, oh, don't worry, that's fine. We're good. Leonard's good. The services are great. They're reliable, which they were. I don't want to forget that. The services were good, were reliable, and sometimes were called upon on very short notice. And to my reading of the book, Craig, Fat Leonard never let the Navy down in terms of services provided.
No, there was one really good story in 2007 that the Bush administration was trying to strike a nuclear cooperation deal with India, right? And this was a big strategic of major importance. And so the Pentagon wanted to send an aircraft carrier for the first time to India on short notice to help seal this deal. And so they sent the USS Nimitz to Chennai, India. But the Navy didn't have a husbanding contractor, didn't have somebody who had provided port services in India, had never taken an aircraft carrier there before. And they asked Leonard, and his company is in Singapore, thousands of miles away. But within a few weeks' notice of this aircraft carrier strike group visiting India, he had to send a flotilla of barges, cranes, tugs from Singapore through a cyclone to India to be there to prepare for the port visit of this aircraft
I'm going to hold you right there. That's a nice grabber. We're going to carry that story over into the next break. After this break, rather, in our next segment, Craig Whitlock is our guest. The story is about Fat Leonard. Stay tuned for segment 3 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
To put this in perspective, the idea that you could get any foreign citizen to convince a U.S. military service member to leak them military secrets is kind of mind-blowing.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Craig Whitlock, pick up that story. So Fat Leonard is having to rush all of this servicing material, ships and other things, to India on incredibly short notice to help the Bush administration, help the U.S. Navy make a good impression.
Yeah, through a cyclone. Like there was actually the crew on his tugs and barges almost mutinied, right? Because they thought they could be sunk literally by this storm. But Leonard forced them to keep going, and it was a bit of a rough port visit because of the weather. One of his barges collided into the USS Nimitz. One of the water taxis that would bring sailors to shore almost sank. So it was a challenging visit, but Leonard was probably the only contractor that could have pulled that off for the Navy. Now, in the end, he made sure he charged the Navy out the nose. He charged them like $6 million for a few days of port visits.
Right.
So he made a lot of money, but he also knew that the Navy knew he was the only guy who, in a pinch, they could count on to do something like that. And for the Navy, honestly, $6 million for something of that importance is, they're not worried too much about, how much he might have gouged them. They're just glad that it happened. The mission to them was more important than what Leonard charged.
So we talked about beverages, Cristal, Dom Perignon. We've talked about Michelin-starred restaurants and food. What about the sex play?
Well, this was the icing on top, right? So Leonard then would figure out quickly who's taking my dinners, who's ignoring the ethics rules, who's taking my Cristal, who's taking the Cuban cigars. And then, subtly or not, he would introduce women into the equation. So there was one restaurant in Singapore, a Michelin-starred restaurant called John, which is on the top floor of a skyscraper, one of the tallest buildings in Singapore. And so Leonard would have Navy officers, the wardroom in for a fancy dinner, maybe anywhere from 15 to 20 people. And then, around 11 o'clock, he'd open the double doors and in would come 15 or 20 women, right? And he would say, here is your entertainment for the evening, right? And it wasn't very subtle what this was about. And they would come in and sit on the officers' laps, and he would see who was comfortable with taking it a step further. And then he'd maybe give them a card key to a room at the hotel and set things up with the women. So it was sort of this unspoken arrangement, as it were, and he figured out pretty quickly who was willing to take him up on the offer. But Leonard was, again, he always took things a step further. He made sure he brought in high-class prostitutes. Sometimes he'd fly them in from other countries, and he would take notes afterward from the women on what these officers' preferences were and what they liked, and he would keep notes on all this.
He would catalog that for future
reference, because he wanted to, as he would put it quite bluntly, I wanted to cater to their every desire and fantasy, give them what they want, and in return, of course, they would let him do what he wanted in terms of overcharging the Navy or doing what he wanted in his business.
And there was a blackmailing component to this as well, was there not?
Well, so
or not an obvious one, but a sub rosa blackmailing, meaning he would keep a lot of information.
He would. Well, it was obvious, and this is the thing. In the U.S. Navy, they all should have been aware of this, right? There's always this threat, particularly if you're a senior officer. You don't want a foreigner to have any information about you that they could use to blackmail you. I mean, that's why they go through background checks, counterintelligence reviews. But Leonard, again, because he was this fat guy who sounded like an American or what, and he was a contractor, so they kind of trusted him, foolishly, and they didn't think that, Leonard might use this to blackmail me, but it was always there in case he needed it. And sometimes he would let people know, like, okay, you have to do this for me. You have to give me that classified information I want. If you don't, he didn't have to go that far, but they knew he had him over a barrel, and so he knew how to use that leverage. He'd watched The Godfather enough,
right,
that he knew how to drop the hammer if he needed it.
And Craig, you just said something really important, classified information. Get to that component of the story. So it's not just overbilling and sort of contract fraud, which anyone who's built a house or done any kind of construction project, that can happen, or a highway gets built or whatever, but there's another component to this as well.
Well, and that's the most striking component in terms of national security, was that for Leonard's business, it gave him a huge edge to know where Navy ships were going weeks or months in advance. And because he would handle hundreds of port visits a year for the U.S. Navy all throughout Asia. And you have to understand, for the Navy, their biggest overseas fleet is in the Asia Pacific. This is where they have almost half of their ships deployed overseas, or in this area of operations. And so Leonard gave him a huge advantage if he knew there was an aircraft carrier strike group going to such and such port weeks or months in advance, because he could pre-position his barges and cranes and other assets. He didn't have to wait till the last minute. Under the rules, he was only supposed to know a few days or weeks in advance, but he
like
wanted,
everyone else,
like his competitors. And the Navy guarded this information on where ships were going very carefully, because they didn't want to have a terrorist group or hostile power
know where they were heading
when they're in port. It's the old saying, "Loose lips sink ships," right? So even family members didn't know where their sailors were going on deployment. It was they.
But
find out
Leonard did.
But Leonard did. So what he would do is and it's kind of hard to get your head around this, but he convinced 10 different U.S. Navy officers to leak him military secrets over a period of 7 years. And the secrets were the ship schedules, so that he would know months or even a year ahead of time where the Navy was thinking of planning of sending these ships. So to put this in perspective, the idea that you could get any foreign citizen to convince a U.S. military service member to leak them military secrets is kind of mind-blowing. But if you could get 10 of them to do it separately over 7 years, a steady diet of classified material, there's really no parallel for this in modern history. I mean, Leonard would have been a great spy master. In terms of espionage, I can't think of anyone else. One single individual is able to leverage 10 different U.S. military personnel to do this. Again, there's no comparison for that. So
you write in a very page-turning way in the book about how Leonard would identify Navy officers and look for weaknesses.
He was brilliant at this.
Zero in on their weaknesses and exploit them to the hilt.
And he had this saying, every sailor has a weakness. Either they drink too much, they don't have enough money, they're in debt, they don't get along with their wife. Every sailor has a weakness.
They're lonely.
They're lonely, and this is how he cultivated an NCIS agent. He realized this was somebody who's lonely and depressed. He became their friend. So he was brilliant at pinpointing what people's personal weaknesses were. Sometimes people were
He's a master psychologist as well as a business person and everything else.
He was, and I think people underestimated that part of him because, again, they saw him as this charming, roguish, jolly fat guy. They didn't see him as a threat to national security, right? They didn't think that guy could somehow persuade people to leak military secrets. But he was this brilliant psychological component to him, and he was a master at it.
Did any harm come from this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, now Leonard's argument was nobody died, nobody got killed, but the harm was the threat to national security and the Navy turning a blind eye to it. I mean, again, this is happening in Asia, where the biggest rivals for the U.S., adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea. I mean, this is a sensitive area of operations. And Leonard's getting classified information from all these U.S. Navy officers. He has hundreds of people blackmail material on them. If he had sold that to the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, and he could have easily, then the scandal you would have had congressional hearings, you would have had to clean house at the Navy, no question. But while this investigation is going on, before Leonard gets arrested, that is the biggest fear of the Justice Department and NCIS, is that what's Leonard doing with this classified material? Is he working
this
for a foreign power? Is he an agent for an adversary like China? And Leonard would say no,
right?
But he acknowledged that the secrets he was keeping were on computer servers.
Right. The risk was there.
And his IT manager was a guy who was friendly with the Chinese, right? He played golf with the Chinese defense attaché in Singapore.
I'm going to stop you right there because we have two things that are carrying us into segment 4 quite dramatically. The Chinese component, foreign adversaries, all this classified information, plus NCIS. It's a show, I think, on a network we're all familiar with. We'll get into that on the other side of this break. I'm Major Garrett, segment 4 of The Takeout, coming your way.
NCIS, I mean, we've all watched the show, right? But it's a
big fan,
serious law enforcement agency, and yet Leonard had them over a barrel too.
Welcome back to The Takeout. We had a couple of grabbers leading into this segment. So, Craig Whitlock, author of Fat Leonard, how one man bribed, bilked, and seduced the U.S. Navy. Fat Leonard was a legitimate security risk, but there's no evidence, as I read the book, that he did pass this classified information to the Russians, to the Chinese, or to the North Koreans.
That he passed it. Now, the question is, it could have been easy for the Chinese to
access it,
to hack his systems, no question. And we
Why
don't
didn't
know
they?
if that happened.
We don't know if that happened.
We don't know if that happened. Of course, the Chinese won't say, right?
No, they won't. No.
But to give you one example of this, so Leonard claimed that he had provided prostitutes to a four-star admiral named Samuel Locklear, who at the time became the top U.S. military commander for all forces in the Pacific. So not just the Navy, but he was a Pacific Command commander. And for any foreign power to have any of that information would have been astounding. And now, Admiral Locklear denied it. He admitted going to these dinners with Leonard, and there are photographs that Leonard has, including of Admiral Locklear hugging Leonard and pretending to lift him off the ground like he's a super strong guy, hoisting Fat Leonard up. So, they were drinking and having a good time, and there was no doubt there were prostitutes at these dinners. Other Navy officers testified to that after the fact. So, almost became immaterial whether these officers actually had sex with the women. They were in the presence of them with Fat Leonard. This was embarrassing material that he or another country could have used to blackmail these senior officials. They, no doubt, if this stuff had been leaked out to Congress or something like that, they would have lost their jobs. So the damage wasn't just theoretical from a national security perspective. It was always out there.
There is a show on the CBS network called NCIS. It has many component parts. Fat Leonard found a way to infiltrate even that. Did he not?
Yeah, and this is, frankly, one of his biggest accomplishments. So NCIS is a law enforcement agency. They have arrest powers. They're like the FBI for the Navy, and they are embedded on ships. They are on military bases overseas. They're responsible for investigating fraud within the Navy, counterintelligence, all these things that you would think Leonard Francis would be worried about. But Leonard was not worried about it because he knew how to cultivate NCIS agents, that he was very good at trading information and gossip about things that were going on in port or foreign officials. So he became very chummy with a lot of NCIS agents. But beyond that, when he saw an opportunity, he would take it. And there was one agent in particular that he sank his claws into, who was named John Beliveau, who was in fact an NCIS Agent of the Year for counterterrorism, so a highly regarded agent based in Singapore. But Beliveau had a drinking problem. He was lonely and depressed. Leonard saw his weaknesses and pounced. And so he would take Beliveau out drinking. He would provide him with women. He wouldn't tell them they were prostitutes. He would make it out like he was just fixing up with a young woman he knew. And soon Beliveau was leaking Leonard criminal case files that NCIS was accumulating about his company. So it turned out NCIS had opened 28 criminal investigations into Leonard's company on suspicion of fraud and other things. Each time, Leonard was able to shut them down or stymie them because he had moles on the inside, like Agent Beliveau, who were feeding him inside information. He knew what witnesses they were talking to. He knew who was ratting him out. He was able to inoculate himself from all these investigations. So again, NCIS, we've all watched the show,
yes,
right? But it's a
big fan,
serious law enforcement agency, and yet Leonard had them over a barrel too, because he had his own people on the inside feeding him law enforcement secrets.
What is Fat Leonard's status as we speak now, and what is the state of the various investigations and pleadings, criminal and otherwise, in the Fat Leonard saga?
So briefly, Leonard pleaded guilty in 2015 in San Diego in federal court to bribery and conspiracy and fraud charges. But then he flipped. He started helping the Justice Department by testifying in private about all these other officers he had bribed over the years. So he's giving all his blackmail files to the Justice Department to help them investigate. But the reason he's doing this, of course, is he wants a light sentence. Long story short, Leonard's about to be sentenced finally in 2022, 2 years ago. But he's worried he's going to have to go back to prison. He was out on home detention, so he was out of jail temporarily.
Kind of a medical release and other things.
He had kidney cancer, he had medical release. Leonard decides he doesn't want to go back to jail. He's gonna escape. And so miraculously, he does. He cuts off his electronic ankle bracelet that the feds had put around him to monitor him. And over Labor Day weekend, he calls an Uber, goes to the border, goes to Tijuana, flies to Cuba, then Venezuela, and he's on the loose. He's on the lam, this big guy, right? He gets picked up on an Interpol warrant after a few weeks. The Venezuelans take him prisoner. They see him as a bargaining chip. And just this last December, they traded him back to the United States in a prisoner swap that the Biden administration orchestrated. So after being on the lam for a year, Leonard is now back in San Diego in jail, waiting again still to get sentenced. And it's important to keep in mind, it's been 10 years since this guy was arrested in a sting operation in San Diego. He still hasn't been sentenced. We don't know what's going to happen to him because the Justice Department, after first winning a lot of convictions, almost 36 convictions in this whole scandal of other Navy officers, people worked for Leonard. Leonard was looking at a long prison time, but because of prosecutorial misconduct in a couple of cases, it's unclear if Leonard will have to go back, stay in jail, or if they may have to let him loose.
Briefly summarize what that misconduct was.
So the misconduct was that there was this big trial in 2022 of 5 Navy officers, including an admiral, on bribery and fraud charges, and that these officers were accused of taking prostitutes and cash bribes and fancy dinners, and in turn giving Leonard things that benefited his company. And 4 of the officers were found guilty by a jury after a 3-month trial. Then it emerged that the prosecution had failed to disclose pertinent evidence, that interviews had been conducted with witnesses that contradicted some of the things prosecutors had said at trial.
Term of art is exculpatory evidence.
Exactly, and this is a big no-no in legal terms, right? So the judge immediately said this is prosecutorial misconduct, it's outrageous, and eventually they essentially tossed out all these felony convictions against these officers. They were allowed to plead guilty to misdemeanors, no jail time. But this really threw a wrench in the works of all the cases, even ones where people had pleaded guilty before, like Leonard, because they could argue that the whole case had been tainted. So this is what a federal judge is going to have to sort out this summer, what to do with Leonard Francis. Does he have to serve time beyond what he already has, or do we have to let him go back to Malaysia, which would sort of be, the capstone to this whole mess, that, will Leonard get the last laugh in the end? And he very well may. In
the 20 seconds we have remaining, will there be a movie or a miniseries?
I hope so, although this is one of these cases where the truth really is stranger than fiction, right? The book is all based, I feel compelled to say it's all based on facts. It's all documented. There's no anonymous sources. It's all documents, on-the-record interviews. It's all true. Nobody can dispute any of it. It's hard to imagine you could write a better screenplay than the truth, but I hope somebody does.
We'll find out. Craig Whitlock, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
You bet. Thank you.
Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial. That's next.
They knew what they were doing was violating ethics rules. They knew what they were doing in many cases was violating the law. I mean, if you give classified information to a foreigner, there's no gray area there.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Craig Whitlock is our special guest. He's been on the program before, August 2021. For those of you who are basically absorbing the archives of the Takeout podcast, and I thank you for doing that. That was about the Afghanistan papers. Craig's a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, award-winning journalist, one of the best in the business. After reading your book, I thought to myself, I'm never going to think about the U.S. Navy the same. Is that an overreaction?
I don't think so, and that's one of the tragedies of all this. I covered the Navy for a number of years. I was a Pentagon correspondent, and I knew a lot of the people who got swept up in this, some of the admirals, and these were upstanding, you thought upstanding characters. These were highly regarded senior military officers. These were people gone to the Naval Academy. These were the best and brightest in the Navy. These weren't, again, people on the margins in the Navy. These were commanding officers, admirals, people who, there were a couple of chiefs of naval operations, the highest ranking officers in the Navy who went to dinner with Leonard Francis and didn't think twice about it. So, yeah, you can't help but think twice or again about the culture of the Navy, their values. And again, it's important to remember the public over time has really venerated the U.S. military, particularly after 9/11. We appreciate everything they've done to protect our country, and they're the most highly regarded institution in America in terms of approval ratings. And there's reason for that, but this is the flip side, unfortunately. And sometimes as reporters, you've got to pull back the curtain
Right.
and show the truth that everything isn't as glorious as it appears on the outside.
Does that reflexive cultural veneration give them more room to be less than ethical?
I think it did in this case. That I think it's important to remember, and I essentially make this argument in the book, that Leonard's zenith of corruption was after 9/11, and that was a time when I think a sense of entitlement started to permeate parts of the U.S. Navy, but particularly the officer corps, that they felt that, we're defending our country, we're away from our families for months at a time. What's the harm if this nice foreigner wants to take us to a fancy dinner? What's the harm if he wants to give me a bottle of champagne or Cuban cigars? But of course, Leonard knew how to keep reeling after that. But there was definitely a sense of entitlement. They knew what they were doing was violating ethics rules. They knew what they were doing in many cases was violating the law. I mean, if you give classified information to a foreigner,
Straight up.
there's no gray area there. You're betraying your country. But again, I think that sense of entitlement, the sense that you're on a pedestal, definitely infused the thinking of a lot of these people that they were entitled.
And that shorthand notion that rank has its privileges and will be protected proved to be true in this.
Absolutely. But again, we get back to Leonard. He knew that rank meant everything, and that he knew if he got some admirals on his payroll or in his pocket, so to speak, who's going to blow the whistle on them?
And even if the whistle was blown and they're in the griddle, from a prosecutorial point of view, many of them escaped the harshest kinds of sentences and that others lower in rank would have surely received.
Right, and the people in the military have a saying for this: different spanks for different ranks, right? And it sounds funny, but it's totally true. So in this case, there were 91 admirals, active duty and retired, who were investigated or questioned in the Fat Leonard case. One went to jail, and that says a lot. And that one who went to jail is the only admiral in history to go to jail for a crime committed while on active duty.
A phrase that pays: different spanks for different ranks. Craig Whitlock, I'll never forget that phrase or your book. Thanks so much for your time.
You bet. Glad to be here.
We'll see you next week.